Hello and welcome to the big debate on S3, SABC News Channel 404, YouTube and on TikTok. My name is Tembekile Mkhototo. Apartheid in South Africa was defeated by a global movement for human rights and justice. From London to New York to Gaza, people took to the streets calling for the release of Mandela. Now, it's South Africa's turn to stand up for those values right across the world. In 2024, millions of lives are threatened by war and human rights abuses, and South Africa is leading the world in taking Israel to the International Court of Justice to halt the genocide against Palestinians. But are we doing enough, and are we selective in our causes that we support as a country? Closer to home, for example, human rights activists in Southern Africa do not always enjoy our support. When it comes to BRICS, we seem willing to overlook human rights abuses and repression of political opponents in the interest of trade. As Tutu once suggested, given our history, should South Africa's international relations be based only on human rights? With me to discuss this are Shannon Ibrahim of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Samantha Hargreaves from Women African Alliance is also here. Ignacy Dumo, a Mozambican activist and researcher, also joins us, as does Philani Mthembu from International Global Dialogue and Roshan Dadu from Boycott, Divest, Sanction, that's BDS here in South Africa. We also have John Fish Hodson from South African Jews for a Free Palestine. In the audience, we have members of the international community, activists, specialists, and the youth. Welcome to you all. Well, what then is your view? Should South Africa be more consistent in our approach to human rights? Take a look.
We charge you with genocide! Biden, you can hide! Biden, you can hide!
South Africa has traveled here today to do what it can to urgently stop the ongoing genocide.
South Africa is taking a leading role on the world stage, bringing Israel to book at the International Court of Justice for the ongoing atrocities being committed against Palestinians in their homeland. Now supported by 12 countries and counting, this unprecedented shift in global politics is arguably a big win for human rights globally.
Not a single country, not a single government in the world has dared to take on Israel. But the South African government has decided to do that.
Free Palestine!
Professor Haida Eid is a Palestinian South African, formerly based at the now destroyed Al-Aqsa University.
I spent the first 2 months of the genocide in Gaza, and during that time I was displaced 3 times, in fact. The second week of the genocide, I lost my house, I lost my neighborhood, I lost my city.
We have seen Israel increasingly become a rogue state, while Western nations, Arab nations, and even South Africa continue trade such as vital coal supplies and weapons. Should South Africa cease coal exports to Israel and help grind the murderous machine to a halt? Or are the economics and politics too complex of a matter for strict ethical guidelines? The Boycott, Divest, Sanction, or BDS movement goes beyond geopolitical trade alliances and has become one of the primary fronts for international solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Students around the world have been setting up solidarity encampments, calling for a free Palestine, a liberated world, and critically calling for divestment from Israel in all its forms.
As students, when we pay the university for an education, we are investing in our education. Therefore, we have firstly the right to know what our money goes towards, and secondly have some sort of say and control over what our money funds.
Every single solidarity activist, every single human being that still believes in human rights should boycott apartheid Israel.
Well, it's time to bring in the panel, and I'll start with you, Shannon, then BDS, boycotting, divesting, sanctioning, right out of the anti-apartheid playbook. South Africa has taken a firm stance against Israel, yet there has not been a halt in trade. Should we not be stopping local business from trading with Israel?
Well, I think that is for civil society to have its voice heard, and largely it's a political decision that Cabinet would have to make. So other than that, I can't really give a personal opinion, but definitely it's something that's been talked about within civil society circles, which are here.
So, and when we come to you then, is there true value until it's gone that far? So it's one thing to go to the ICJ, but if we're still exchanging money with the Israelis, how much weight does the country's position have?
Well, I mean, I think we can see with the ICJ ruling the flagrant disregard for that ruling by Israel. I think South Africa and the apartheid history, economic sanctions played a critical role in forcing the National Party to the negotiating table. So I think we do need to invest heavily in organizing and campaigning for economic sanctions.
And Roshan, if we stop doing business with any country accused or guilty of human rights violations all the way up to genocide, as is the allegation against Israel, you wonder how many people South Africa would have left to trade with. Is it fair to say that?
I think in this case, absolutely, we should impose a trade embargo and particularly stop selling coal. And there is a precedent. Colombia, just about 10 days ago, the president of Colombia said that he was proposing that they stopped selling coal, and they're the biggest exporters. South Africa is Israel's third biggest importer. But it's not that big a trade that we have with Israel, actually. And there are many other markets, and there's absolutely no justification for fueling a genocide. It's a very specific situation of settler colonialism, of apartheid, and of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And honestly, I think South Africa does have the political and moral responsibility, as has been said. We asked the international community for exactly the same sanctions, exactly the same economic and trade embargoes, and it had an impact. We're sitting here now today because we managed to dismantle apartheid in South Africa in support of our struggle on the ground, in the country, the international community, through the anti-apartheid movements and the boycotts and the divestments and the sanctions and the effects it had on companies and governments, even ultimately the reactionary Western governments. And I think we absolutely have to be taking the same action against apartheid Israel.
So Pinali, I want to bring you in. Would it be difficult to basically impose economic sanctions on Israel, given South Africa's stance on its ongoing bombardment of Gaza?
Well, I think what's important to acknowledge is that over time, the trade relations and the economic relations with Israel have been on the decline. The reality is that with the downgrade of South Africa's embassy in Israel, and also subsequent pressure on Israel's diplomatic representation in South Africa, is that the conditions for economic cooperation have been on the decline. And so it's not that it would be difficult. Pressure has been coming from civil society. And those are also lessons, I think, from the anti-apartheid movement, because states also move as the mood of citizens shifts. So you can already see that on the South African landscape, but also globally, there has been increasing pressure on Israel as a state and on the legitimacy of its actions. And that definitely has economic implications.
So Zara, is that enough then, that there's been a decline in trade, not necessarily a boycott or economic sanctions?
I don't think just a decline would be enough. I think we also need to look at the moral responsibility that we have as a society as well. I mean, just separate from government trade, right? We have a responsibility to boycott ourselves. The boycott of companies that fund or have stakes in the Israeli apartheid occupation, right? And I mean, just when we come to trade, right, we have to look at South Africa's role. I mean, like it was mentioned earlier, when we started the ICJ case, it became a domino effect of other countries also coming out in support. So we would expect a similar reaction to a trade boycott, right? We started, even if we don't have that many stakes with Israel, that much trade with Israel, if one person or one country starts it, we can expect a similar domino effect in trade boycotting around the world. We started, other people join, and that's the economic pressure that will actually, sort of result in Israel stopping. Or
John Hodgson? Hassan, any boycotts then, would those change the situation in any material way in the Middle East at the moment, you think?
Boycotts are important as a tool to change the situation. As you've heard from other panelists, A lot of historical cases show us that boycotts have been a part of bringing down systematic oppression, apartheid in this country, and trying to stop a genocide. And we have to do everything that we can. It's only if we take action that we encourage others to take action together, right? I sit here representing South African Jews for a free Palestine because we're not disconnected. What happens in Palestine is part of us, and what happens here is part of Palestine. And the questions about economic calculus versus what we all know we should do to change the world are mistaken, because they assume that we can live the lives we want, all of us in South Africa, if people elsewhere in the world aren't living the lives they need to live. You can't have values of freedom and democracy and liberation and justice only in one place, ever. It doesn't work, and it never has.
TK, how much of a tightrope is South Africa walking on the issue of Israel and the Palestinians? Because the Israelis, when they talk about this, even when they went to the ICJ, said all they're doing is that they're defending themselves after the attacks by Hamas on October 7th. South African government says, well, we don't condone what Hamas did in attacking southern Israel on that day in October. What we are saying, what the South African government is saying, is that you've simply gone too far, where there's been attacks targeting civilians in Gaza. So if that is the position, why aren't we seeing more beyond just the court case of the ICJ? Is it difficult to action that?
Look, I think it is rather quite difficult, and history just shows us, right? Let's take maybe something closer to the actual region, Saudi Arabia. You would think Saudi Arabia, given its history and its importance to the religion of Islam, would be the first to say, listen, we want nothing to do with Israel. Remember, that's right there in the region. If I'm not mistaken, over the last 3 years, they've actually been opening up diplomatic and also economic trades with them. So it kind of shows you that here is Saudi Arabia, very close to the issue, very close to the region. How much more for a country like South Africa? Because sometimes in these debates, I think it does get lost upon South Africa that, listen, we're not the biggest country in the world, right? There are other pressures. Now, it's easy to say, look, let's do A and B and C this. Let's put you in a situation where you're saying, look, I think as of 2021, the trade between South Africa and Israel was, I think, 285 million, right? But of US dollars. Yes, it's small. I think it's 0.04 of anything else. But you need to then be able to explain to a citizen in Emahleni, right? Because that's a call that people discuss that, listen, right, I'm taking this contract away based on this principle. What does that really mean? Where I think the South African government has done well, because remember, you said it is a tightrope, is that South Africa has said, listen, there's certain battles that you do need to choose. And one of them they've done better than I think most countries is to politically put pressure on Israel. Now, you can question the government to say, listen, what about the economics? But I think, as my colleague has said, it is something that comes a bit later on. But we can't just live in a world where we believe that, listen, we can just turn off the tap.
Right. So, Roshan, easier said than done then, based on what TK is saying, because even countries in the region have not fully written off Israel based on the situation in Gaza.
I think South Africa can take more action against Israel. It can stop selling coal. It's not the only market in the world, and as everyone has said, it's a small percentage of our export market, and yet it's the third biggest import market in coal for Israel. So if you're telling me there's no other countries in the world that we can export coal to, let alone the arguments around coal as one of the most polluting aspects of climate change, and the arguments around moving towards a just transition. And yes, that means getting the trade unions on board, that means workers' jobs, but it doesn't mean losing jobs. None of the exports we export would mean necessarily any detrimental impact on our economy in the case of Israel, and yet it has a big impact economically on Israel. Why? One of the reasons Israel's so keen to genocide Gaza of the Palestinian people is to get its hands on the supposed new gas fields that are found off the coast of Gaza. Israel's desperate for energy, and it needs energy to fuel the war as well, fuel the occupation, the 75 years of occupation.
Thanks, Roshan. So when we return, we will ask what role South Africa is playing to further human rights on the continent. You're watching The Big Debate. should have mixed you guys up more. All the men are on one side. Yes. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations and human rights. South Africa is playing a key role in challenging the alleged genocide conducted or committed by Israel in Gaza. That matter is yet to be decided on by the International Court of Justice. But what about human rights closer to home? Have a look.
In Mozambique, the discovery of over $100 billion of natural gas in the north has resulted in the descent of multinational corporations, major conflict in the region, and the displacement of thousands of people. Ahmad Bakar was a fisherman.
Tuhamisha kuja mjini hapa. Baada ya kuja mjini hapa, mazingira ya mjini hapa, naona mazingira ya mjini sio mazuri kama nyumbani kule.
That gas, the intention is to export it into South Africa, and that's already been happening under Sasol. With that volume of financial investment totaling more than $1 billion, this has been accompanied by the deployment of the South African National Defence Force as part of a Rwanda-led deployment.
Is the negotiating table looking very different under BRICS leadership?
Now we have new actors, particularly Russia, India, and China, who do want poorer, more marginal global south countries playing a role in servicing and offering up their raw materials at the lowest value possible.
We have international companies trying to extract resources in African countries, creating situations of tensions and conflicts to extract resources without any kind of profits for the communities, for the government, and for the development of the countries.
Tanele Maseko is an activist from Eswatini who went into hiding after her husband was shot dead because of their fight for human rights in Africa's last remaining absolute monarch.
During the South African struggle, Swaziland was the hub for most of these leaders. South Africa is going all out using taxpayers' money, South African taxpayers' money, to go to the ICJ, to engage openly. And yet, right next door to you, 4 hours drive, people are dying.
Let's speak to Egna now, who is actually from Mozambique. Egna, the situation in the north has been going on in Mozambique for years now. There was even the deployment of a regional force. South Africa participated in that. There was a peace effort. Is that enough? And do you compare the response to the way in which South Africa has actively been fighting for the rights of Palestinians, for instance?
I think it's not a good idea to compare the situation. We understand that the situation in Palestine is quite particular. We are talking about genocide, but maybe we can say that we expect more from South Africa, especially in the relation to Cabo Delgado, not only related with the deployment, but the solidarity with the situation, and try to understand, and we expect more action from South Africa.
What would more action and more solidarity look like for you?
I think solidarity, even for the South African in general, but from the government of South Africa, we expected more. I think we were expecting more from the SADC, and then we're expecting something else from South Africa, and maybe we forgot, or South Africa forgot, that they are regional power. They have responsibility not only in the context of the region, but in the context of human rights. What we are seeing related with the situation in Palestine is very important, it's very good, but we never seen something similar when we had the problems in Cabo Delgado.
And Shannon, Egna makes a good point that you can't compare the two situations, right? Both in duration and in scale. Perhaps speak to us about how the decisions around intervention, involvement in a peace effort or any other mechanism to address a conflict, how those decisions are reached by the South African government.
Well, clearly on the severity of the conflict, and we could all see what was happening after October 7th. I think we crossed a Rubicon in Gaza. Never since World War II has an entire population been starved at such a fast pace. And I really think our government did an amazing job by taking this case to the ICJ a number of times, asking for provisional measures, and we got the rulings that we wanted from the ICJ. But when we look at Africa, I think what we try to do is not only have a military presence on the ground. So we have a military presence in the northern part of Mozambique. We also are part of the SADC mission in the Eastern Congo. And I think that is important because we have to stop the armed conflict in order to address the root causes of the conflict. But I think what we always tend to forget, for example, the Eastern DRC is probably the largest amount of cases of rape of women and girls in the world. The M23 was supposed to have been disbanded in 2013, and now it's resurged. And we're trying
and they appear stronger, in fact.
And yeah, and we're trying to neutralize that as a negative force, as well as the ADF and the FDLR. These are negative forces that are bringing about this instability. But we also have to tackle what is behind this conflict, which is the illegal exploitation of mineral resources. And I think that's important. And in a similar way, and I think the same is said for Mozambique. So our minister has said we need to look at the root causes of what is happening in Cabo Delgado, and that is also having social economic programs to help people who are in desperate poverty. Right. And it is only when they can have a reason and a means by which to gain a living and income generating activities that we'll start to see a change. So our role is not only military and security related, but human security, and to offer hope to people by addressing the root causes.
Samantha, thank you. When you look at the situation in Cabo Delgado, one of the criticisms is that the region has basically stepped in to protect corporate interests, right? Because there is huge extraction. The petroleum companies are interested in that region. Is that a fair critique? And to what Shannon was saying, is South Africa striking the right balance, if you will, in assessing situations and responding appropriately, be it in Cabo Delgado, be it in Gaza, be it in the DRC, in Goma?
So I think with Cabo Delgado, I think the South African government has not stepped forward as it needs to. The reality is that Sasol has about $160 million invested in gas in Mozambique. Standard Bank has invested more than $365 million in Total Energies. And I can continue. The Development Corporation here has similarly invested. So we have to ask big questions about what is fueling the conflict in Cabo Delgado. And that is about resource extraction and who controls the wealth and the profits from that resource extraction. So we have massive multinational corporations that are involved. The only way to really stop that conflict is to stop extraction. And so that does require that critical questions are asked about how we respond to parastatals that are actually investing in gas extraction in Cabo Delgado.
Foreign policy, I see you chatting a bit. Foreign policy is not a one-size-fits-all type of thing, am I right to say? But are we striking the right notes in doing so?
Well, I'll put it this way, and this is where maybe it's going to get a bit controversial. People assume international relations and foreign rights sometimes is based on the promise of morals. If I'm not mistaken, countries that really have a thing called national interest kind of look at it, it's amoral. It's about, at the end of the day, what is your national interest in the country? Let's look at it this way, because this is how I look at the question of Mozambique, right? Now, I know you mentioned Delgado. If I'm not mistaken, the Institute of Security Studies actually showed that it was a failure of their government there to actually look after their population, right? So that's more of a service delivery issue. When escalated, and we tend to know this for sure, that when you don't look after your people in places where, let's say, war is very close, they do tend to look for extremists, right? Now, if the South African government, if I was them, the question I'd ask is, how do I help Mozambique? Not how do I come and do what we don't want countries like America to do, to come preach and say, hey, you, Frelimo, bad, 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 right? Because when the Americans do that to South Africans, we get into a hissy fit. So the question would be, how do we help the Mozambican government? Well, the first thing I'd say is, look, the issues of how you collect your tax and how you administer it, right? We've got a world-class institution in SARS. Those are the things you start doing to influence national interest. And the question of extraction, I'm not for this idea that just extraction stops it. No, the question is, it's employment, right? So what can South Africa do? What they should have done in the 90s, South Africa had a plan, which was to say, how do we actually make Mozambique's gas closer to South Africa and actually create almost like a belt within SADC, such that we don't even need to import oil from any other places in the world. That's what you need to start doing to do that. Because I think this idea of simply looking at it saying, look, if we stop this one thing, it's going to happen. No, South Africa, and this is why I do critique our government, the South African government has been very poor at defining what it means by a national interest. It's easy to go to human rights, which are not universal, by the way, because people assume that. That's the one assumption they make. What we should have been doing is to say, how does South Africa become more, and how do I put it? It's going to offend people. South Africa's foreign policy should be more muscular in the region. She said it.
Is foreign policy ultimately, TK, down to what you were saying, national interest? And ultimately, it's a game of hypocrisy, right? Because everyone, every country chooses when to condemn and when not to condemn rights abuses.
It's a give and take in this situation. If we as if the South African government properly invested in SADC, right? And SADC also means you tell places like ZANU-PF, parties which I think of an existential threat to South Africa, that listen, we can't keep having what you've been doing because it's literally impacting on us as a society. But what we give in return, and this is where you use of state-owned entities to say, let's invest in those countries, right? But you invest in things which the population will see it would work. At the end of the day, what you don't want is, we don't want to administer an election in those countries. It should be up to those citizens to be able to do that, not South Africa.
Egna, you're from Mozambique. Does TK make a fair point about national interest, and all the other probabilities, possibilities that a government like the one in Pretoria would have to weigh in its interventions, whatever they might be?
Well, I think the most important thing here is that we need to look at the national interest of South Africa and national interest of Mozambique, yes, but we also need to look at the story of Mozambique and South Africa back in the times. So we need to understand this story and try to find why we're having these struggles, why we are having this challenge now. So I think we are missing the part that Mozambique and South Africa have a bad story back in times, and we need to understand this story. So where South Africa is now related with the story we had before. We need to remember that South Africa bombed Mozambique years ago. So how we accept foreign support directly from South Africa, and how South Africa is behaving, showing that they have a real interest to support Mozambique at that time.
Do you feel South Africa owes Mozambique something because of the history?
I can't say owes, but maybe we need more from South Africa, and we need that South Africa shows real interest to support Mozambique. And maybe we are not seeing this interest from now. So we are always backing on the times, and remember that South Africa, yes, is a regional power. They have power, and maybe we need the support of South Africa, but we must remember that these people bombed us like years ago.
Egna, thank you very much for that. When we come back, we talk about the BRICS group of nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Stay with us. Wow. Oh, sure. Don't worry. In the second hour, make a note of that and be like, by the way, sir. Cool. What am I doing? Okay. Okay. Oh, here we go.
Coming back from an ad break.
Welcome back to the big debate on international relations. Do we pick and choose as South Africa when to be principled in our international relations? In a moment, we'll talk about BRICS. We have placed our faith in a group of nations that we hope will help us, for example, challenge US imperialism. But will it really? We'll speak to the panel in a moment, but earlier we're talking about the presence of the South African government in terms of diplomacy and addressing or responding to conflicts, human rights violations and suffering. And we heard about the situation in the north of Mozambique. I want to bring in someone else who's here with us tonight from the DRC. So if I can ask you to stand up and give us a sense of how you assess South Africa's involvement in the situation back home, because at the moment there are South African soldiers involved there in the government effort to fight off the M23. In fact, more have died this week.
Well, what I would like to say about the involvement of South Africa in terms of the DRC is more what we have seen in terms of imperialism right from the beginning. And what we are trying to say here, South Africa is not an insular country in Africa. It's part of Africa. And if I may recall history, and in terms of the Congo, but it might be Mozambique, it might be Zimbabwe, and many other African countries in terms of what we dealt with as Africans for South Africa during apartheid. And this is a time where we are seeking for reciprocity in what is happening in the Congo. We must remember in the Congo, that conflict, it's a Congocide. We are talking about genocide, but I often speak about Congocide. We cry in silence, we die in silence. We appreciate the efforts that South Africa has made by sending the troops in the Congo, but it requires a deeper understanding of that conflict, that is the extraction of minerals, the women that have been raped, the children that are soldiers, so that you are able to bring peace and change, not only in the Congo, but throughout Africa. We have 17 countries in Africa that are at war.
I wonder if you are able to respond to that, perhaps understand the response by the South African government to the situation in Eastern DRC.
Well, I agree with you entirely in the sense that there's so much deeper levels of problems that have to be addressed rather than just security. So we know what the M23 and the other forces are after in the Eastern DRC, and it's been that way for the last 24 years and before that even. And it's quite difficult for South Africa to impact on addressing the mineral extraction, but I think we need to have those discussions with the government in the Congo to see what can be done. And as you know, we are a part of the AU Peace and Security Council, and I think we need to work under the auspices of the African Union to address these issues holistically so that we can have a regional approach, because we need to involve the countries in the region in finding a solution to those problems. And I do agree that sometimes, we forget that the number of people who are dying in the Congo is astronomical, and we can't pretend that, that perhaps the Middle East is the only place where people are dying. We also need to provide equal attention to Africa.
Philani, in terms of the expectations that some countries on the continent have of South Africa, how much of that is realistic? When you hear about the intervention some people in Mozambique are seeking from this country, what is happening in the DRC and what our guest was saying he would like to see happening there, is it doable?
Well, it is doable. It's part of South Africa's responsibilities as an international actor. We must remember that under the apartheid government, South Africa was responsible for a lot of destruction within its immediate region. The state apparatus was used to essentially subvert the development aspirations in our immediate region. And being a larger economy, we do have a responsibility beyond our borders. And this tells you that human rights as a more holistic meaning. There is also the right to development. And so South Africa has to be engaged not only in terms of peace and security, it has to be encouraging its corporations also to be involved, but also there needs to be a set of guidelines for how corporations engage in the extraction of mineral resources.
I want to come to you then, Roshan. Let's talk about BRICS, right? South Africa is part of BRICS. Saudi Arabia, already one of the countries that have said they want to be part of this. When you look at some of the other members of BRICS, the Indian government is accused of abusing, suppressing the rights of minorities. Russia has invaded Ukraine in the last 2 years. China is accused, for example, of abusing Uyghur Muslims, for instance. What does that say about our commitment as a country to human rights at its truest, most basic form?
Well, before we get onto BRICS, going back to our own continent, if you look at all these areas that have been discussed where there are conflicts now, you'll find the hand of Israel. So I think one of the things that we can do as South Africa is continue to take this leading role, because Israel acts with its big chummy, the United States, doesn't it? If you look at the extractivism in the DRC, if you look up the mess up over the last few decades, just one name, Dan Gertler, an Israeli business tycoon that is complicit in so much corruption, so much meddling, so much interference that's fueled the conflict over initially diamonds and then moved on to other minerals. That's extractivism, where the benefit doesn't go to the people in the country, as has been said. If you look at the Sudan, they're meddling now, Israel, in the conflict in the Sudan. They tried 2 years ago to get the government to normalize relations using the UAE, talking about the wider Middle Eastern world. Why do you think they are so bothered? And why do you think everywhere an apartheid state like Israel appears in our continent, there's some kind of conflict, or they're fueling repressive regimes, like in Kenya? Those police that act like a paramilitary, state police of Kenya that we saw, gunning down protesters just yesterday and the day before, they're trained by Israel, and they were originally. Also, Kenya buys weapons, it buys tear gas. We saw tear gas being sprayed in the crowd. One of the things Kenya does is purchase those kinds of repressive things from Israel. The other one is spyware. Look at the mess up in the elections in Ghana some years ago. It turned out it was Israeli spyware that was used to damage the election process. That's what they're doing in our continent, not just in South Africa.
So I think
the world is connected, and just divorcing one thing from another. I think at the moment we're standing up as South Africa. We're standing up to the most powerful nations in the world.
I want to take a point you're making,
in the
Roshana,
ICJ and in other ways, and we should do so more, because I think it will benefit not just South Africa. It's in our national interest, and it's in our continent's interest.
But I want to take the important point you made about the world being connected and bring it to you, because one of the things we've seen since the beginning of this year has been the encampments on campuses in the US, parts of the UK, Europe as well, even at Wits University. I'm not sure about the other campuses in the country. And I'm curious about what you see as the role of young activists, students actually, not necessarily activists, but people who in everyday life see violations of human rights, which they say, actually, that's unacceptable.
I mean, I think there is like a trend in the youth of actually noticing what's going on and the sort of superficial solidarity that our government shows, right? We see them intervening in Palestine, we see them intervening in DRC, we see them intervening in North Mozambique, but what are they actually addressing? Sure, they're there for peace and security, but are they actually there for the interests of the citizens? How much are we actively helping the citizens there right now? Right? Earlier it was mentioned that there's a decline because of the pressure being put on Israel, but how has that actually manifested in Israel's actions? Has it caused Israel to stop? They're still going at Gaza relentlessly, right? And that shows that, like she was saying, everything is interconnected, because the actual demons we're fighting is things like Western imperialism, is things like the traces of colonialism. That's what we are actually supposed to be fighting, but then the government turns around and do we actually fight imperialism, or do we just go there and say we're fighting peace and we're fighting for peace and security, but we don't actually fight those villains? And that's something that the youth is starting to notice, and that's why you'll see a sort of radicalization within our youth of turning against the very roots of these systems, of our systems that are simply embedded in these villains like imperialism and colonialism.
Got you. So, how do we, I'll come to you in a moment, John, how do we then, TK, prevent BRICS being a different grouping of countries that ultimately does nothing for the people, but is more self-serving for the elites in those nations, to what you were saying?
Well, look, I think that's probably the hardest thing to do, right? To be able to change institutions like that. Now, what I think makes BRICS a bit unique in that is, look, it's a lot of developing countries, right? And sometimes when we speak about the question of the national interest, look, there's three things I always just look at. I look at the national budget, I look at the proclamations of those countries. And if you look at most of the BRICS Plus now, I think that's what it's called, a lot of those countries have really done a lot of things. If you look at China, the amount of people it's taken out of poverty. Now, obviously India as well is also going in that direction. But again, and I have to go back to this point that it's one thing for you to proclaim that you want to be able to do this, but I always want to ask South Africans who are very passionate about this is, where does that line stop where you now want to start acting such like America? Because you see, it's one thing for you to say, look, I want to be able to go tell the Chinese off that what you're doing is right and wrong. The Chinese will turn back into you and say, but wait, we're not the very same country who was complaining when the US, when the ambassador was making a comment here in South Africa about what they would like to see happen in this country. So I think the best things to do is to be able to say, and I think Pilan kind of touched on it, to say, and I think she kind of puts the foot on, which is to say, how far do you want to extend South Africa's influence? Now, I'm very clear, it's a controversial point. I think South Africa should be very selfish about its interest. Our interest is SADC, right? First and foremost.
So ignore the rest?
No, it doesn't mean you ignore, but you put the budget behind that, right? Because this is the other thing that we're missing. The reason why our reach has been so weak, look at the budget of DERCO over the last 20 years. It's been in decline, right? That means your ability to be able to go to these multilateral institutions, to be able to speak for countries like Palestine, does diminish. So if it's an old adage, if you fix your own backyard first, if we make sure that works, that gives you the power to be able to amplify your voice. And this is where I do critique the South African government, that their national interest has been very poor, and South Africa is a reluctant power in the region to take control and be able to say, hey, this is the direction that we are going.
Got you, TK. When we come back, we'll look for solutions. Stay with the big debate. Sorry? I can't hear you, Ben.
Who's the what? 1 minute back.
This student. This is Samantha. Which student? There are Julia. Is that Julia? Please find out who Julia is. Oh, Julia, is that you? Are you Julia?
Who's that? Who's the what?
We're going to come to you first, okay? Oh, I was told we'll come to... Were you selected to speak?
30 seconds back.
Are you going to speak? Would you like to speak? You can't...
Stand by for 10.
Welcome back to the big debate on international relations and human rights. Should we be doing more to raise human rights issues with those we call our friends as a country? Let's hear your views as well. Remember, you can get in touch with us on social media. We also have our audience here, and we're going to try to speak to as many people as possible, just to get a sense of the temperature in the room. If I could speak to you first, ma'am, and ask you to stand up and give us your name and where you're from and your takeaway tonight.
I'm Julia Hope. I am a member of South African Jews for a Free Palestine and various youth organizations in Cape Town as well. My takeaway for tonight is that I think we need to be steadfast in our morals. I think we can't kind of dilly-dally with the notion that, we're going to find a more just solution. And, I did want to pick up on this, is that it's not that it's South Africa's turn to show the world or to support the world in a way that they did for us. We have to be showing up for our people simultaneously in a way that we still aren't, in a way that we still haven't dealt with apartheid and injustices here. And I believe very strongly that that solution can be kind of multi-pronged, and the same institutions that we're targeting is not only, whether we're targeting the coal industry because of its debilitating potentials that it could have for white supremacist Israel. It also is the only solution in South Africa for a just transition. I mean, if you speak to mining affected communities in South Africa, there is no future in which our industries are dominated by privately owned coal. We need a just transition.
Thank you. So, if I can ask you to stand up, what's your name and where are you from?
My name is Germain Kaindo Muira. I'm coming from DRC, and I've been here for so long, and I'm a member of civil society of South Africa.
And your thoughts on South Africa's handling of human rights violations across the continent and elsewhere?
It's very sad what South Africa is doing, because of when you see how they are handling first the people here in South Africa who are coming from outside. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. South Africa should do more because of the way those countries supported South Africa when they was in big trouble. They see people like refugees, they don't process anything as papers, and everything is collapsing, and so there is nothing that South Africa is doing more to people who are coming outside.
Okay, thank you, sir. John, I want to take that point, because I know you wanted to speak earlier. What the gentleman was saying, I wonder if you want to respond to that. I want to take it and put it together with what TK was saying. For example, that one of the things you need to do is tend to your own backyard before you branch out too far. Is that a fair assessment? Given just the weight of the problems this country has domestically.
The mistake that is being made is to think that the problems we have here are divorced from the problems people have in Mozambique and in Kenya and in the DRC and elsewhere across the world, right? I have to say that my friend TK over here is fudging things, because he makes it sound like we're playing a game of you pick your conflict, you pick your friends, you choose where to get involved, you can't do everything, right? The first question is, he wants to say, let's deal with our own backyard. Whose backyard? How did this become anyone's backyard, right? Who was ever living here in the first place? Who was ever living in Palestine, right? I'm very glad, at least, that we're talking about the continent today, because as South Africans, we have a real problem of thinking we aren't part of the rest of this continent, and not talking, as the gentleman just said, about the serious Afrophobia. It's not xenophobia, Afrophobia that goes on in this country, right? So I want to take you lastly back to Kenya, which Roshan was speaking about, right? Look what's happening in Kenya right now. There's a set of protests going on largely driven by youth, right? Why? Because the government is introducing taxes that make it too expensive to eat and to get around and to live. Why is the government doing that? Partly because they are not the ones. It's not William Ruto who's going to be hungry tonight and can't drive to work tomorrow. It's ordinary people in Kenya. Why? Because Kenya has vast national debt. And I want to say at this point in time that debt is borrowed partly from the West and the IMF and partly from China. They're in the same WhatsApp group on this issue, right? The point, Tembi, is that to change what happens here, we have to change things internationally. And to change things internationally, we have to change what happens here. So the idea is we need to think beyond these borders, right? And beyond these narrow notions of national interest. Because what TK is saying is not going to feed the starving South Africans tomorrow.
Okay. TK, I'd like to respond when we come back. Because when we return here on The Big Debate, we'll get a last word from the panel in this first part of the program. Stay with The Big Debate. So we're going to close this segment, and then I'm going to come to you guys when we don't have time constraints. Okay. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations. We're nearing the end of part one of our debate. The discussion will continue, though, in the second part, which will be live on YouTube as well as Facebook, X and TikTok. Just look for the Big Debate SA. But before we wrap up, let's have a final word from the panel. And TK, I want to start with you because there was a fair amount of disagreement with what you had to say earlier about national interests and basically tending to our own backyard. Final thought.
Let me return the favor to my friend, as he was saying, that I think when you fudge the facts, the point is at least supposed to say what the person fudged, if I'm not mistaken. Now, he speaks about whose backyard is it. If I'm not mistaken, the whole debate has been centered about South Africa doing more. That tells me other countries are looking towards South Africa. So that kind of defines whose backyard we're speaking about, namely South Africa's backyard. And if you noted what I said South Africa is reluctant. Reluctant doesn't mean you walk in with an army into that country. It basically means you actually understand that, listen, what would really help a country like Mozambique, what would help Zimbabwe, is if the South African government proactively, with the private sector, came in to say, listen, how do we actually get Mozambique, how do we get Zimbabwe to actually work better so that their population can then be able to play an active role in their own independence? We're not about making you a sovereign. We're not about...
I'm going to have to ask everyone else to be more brief. We will continue in the second part. Philani, one thought.
Well, South Africa has to implement what it's already decided on, which is basically operationalize the South African Development Partnership Agency. This will basically expand the work that South Africa is already doing through the African Renaissance Fund. It is able to put resources into addressing the root causes of development challenges within Africa. And I think it can do that through both state-led financing, including through the development finance institutions, and it can do that by also bringing in the private sector. But the state will have to regulate how the private sector and monitor how the private sector is engaged in countries that are extracting resources.
John?
There's a very important old Jewish value, which we stand on as SAJFP. The word is doikait, and it means making home wherever you find yourself, with whoever lives there, wherever they've come from and wherever you've come from, not taking people's homes. And we're not in the business of saying South Africa should be going around telling people what to do. We're in the business of saying people matter. Borders kill people. Every day from Africa to Europe, and here, and in Palestine, the notion of nonsensical borders and South Africa's borders cause harm every day. If we think about people rather than elites, if we think about people rather than governments, people all across the world need to be living.
Shannon?
What I would like to say is to look at how we were talking about BRICS and how is BRICS in our national interest. So what I wanted to point out, what is our national interest actually? And we are driven in our foreign policy by our national interest, and that is to spur economic growth, to create jobs in this country, to have a better quality of life and standard of living for South Africans. So how does that relate to BRICS? Our trade, since we've been in BRICS, has escalated absolutely exponentially. We have the new development bank, which is giving us new forms of funding without the conditionalities imposed by the IMF, which is allowing us to do projects to build infrastructure, to also trade in our local currencies, which is what we're planning to do. And we're able through, with China and Russia to have technology transfer and knowledge transfer. And these are things that we're benefiting from.
Briefly for everyone else, Igna?
No. I think I have, maybe we can reflect on this to understand how or why South Africa needs to do something more. Maybe we can try to understand why Mozambique decided to bypass South Africa and ask support to Rwanda or ask support outside the region. I think we need to start thinking about this, and then we will find the answers and try to...
Sam?
So I think the one question we really have to ask is, what do we mean by national interest? Whose national interest? In the South African context, if you look at the dominant, where power is located, it's located like everywhere in the world, in big corporations, in the economic elite. So if you were to speak to a South African here about what does development mean to you, you're going to get a very different response to what a corporate executive is going to tell you. And
our national interest is the same around the world. It's international solidarity that can help us all together to challenge power, to challenge the West, to challenge imperialism, And I think if we remember the famous quote of Madiba, our freedom's incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. The apartheid regime was like this with the Israeli regime, with the apartheid regime here. And that's the problem that we have now with Mozambique. And we should be helping the Mozambique people to kick Israel out. They have a port facility in Maputo. Kick them out of the DRC, and kick them out of Kenya, because that's where the problem is. And it's international solidarity amongst people that's going to bring that transformation that we all want here and in our neighbor countries and throughout the world.
Dave, final word?
I mean, it's like I said earlier, the superficiality of South Africa's intervention, right? What are the actual root causes? Imperialism, capitalism. The West is imperialism. The elites, corporations are capitalism. We can't pair with those villains to solve the same problems they created. Human rights will never be at their interest.
Thank you. Thank you all. So, South Africa is clear. The government says it is opposed to genocide. We take our starting point from our own struggle for freedom all those decades ago, in fact, just as recently as the early 90s. And yet we seem to be selective in holding our allies to account. Are we hypocrites when it comes to international relations? As always, you decide. Part 2 of this debate continues online in a few moments. See you now. Thank you, everybody. Can't hear you. Okay. Is that going to be an auto cue, or am I? Okay. Do you know what it's about? Okay. Thank you, Bataki. Yes, then they must come in. Wait, I'm not good to go. I need a quick touch-up. Thank you. Gotta look my best. Guys, you never know. My potential spouse could be watching. I'm sorry we didn't tell you, but this is actually my wedding. Welcome. Yes, actually, that should be the poll question. Are you the right partner? Tweet us, SMS us, 3 months bank statements, proof of address. I'm ready, Makosini. Oh, straight to the music. Okay, I'm gonna stand here so I don't boil. Welcome back to the second part of the big debate. We're live on YouTube as well as X as well as Facebook, I think, as well. Today we're still talking about South Africa's policy, foreign policy. What do we do during times of human rights violations and conflict in various parts of the world? In the DRC, South Africa, as part of the regional troop deployment there was also deployment of troops to northern Mozambique. When it comes to Israel and its military offensive, the war on Gaza, we know South Africa has gone all the way to the International Court of Justice to argue that the Israeli government is committing acts of genocide. So in this part of the program, we're going to allow the audience to be able to contribute to the discussion. And we'll start on this side this evening. There are already a few hands that I had noted earlier. Ma'am, I'd like to start with you. Where are you from and what's your question? I'll hold it for you. Please stand up.
My name is Lupio Mgulwa. I'm from Swaziland. So it's not necessarily a question from me, but I find it very interesting that just not so long ago and currently as we speak, a country so close to South Africa like Swaziland is still dealing with a massacre that was done in 2001 to June 2021. And the reality is that these are issues in Africa that have always been there. And I think that we continue to say the same things, but we don't see any difference in how we approach these things. Why is it that we have not received any support from advocacy from South Africa in terms of the Swazi people who are oppressed by the royal Swazi in terms of the king himself, which is an absolute monarchy? The only thing we've ever received from South Africa is a mild statement indicating that they are not for what is currently happening in Swaziland. And that was it. And that's the many examples that are happening in different countries. So it also becomes very important for us as South Africans to take a stand. And how do we do that? I think South Africans are not empowered enough, in my view, to be able to take some of these international relations discussions and debates to the forefront of their governments. South Africa is supporting Swaziland. 50% of the SACU receipts are going to Swaziland. That is how Swaziland is being sustained. Not Swaziland as in the people, but the royal family in which they live an opulent lifestyle as we speak.
Thank you. Sir, you wanted to say something as well. Let me see if I can squeeze in here. Can I ask you to please stand up and give us your name?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sipiri Jr. Shosholo, and I'm from the Free State, Bloemfontein. My question is directed to the gentleman in the panel that stated that, you know, economic trade shouldn't be used or shouldn't be treated like a tap you can close and open. When I hear genocide, I immediately think of urgency. So my question to the panel and everyone else is, how much longer should we wait before economic trade can be sanctioned, taking into consideration the fact that people are dying and that people that are living in danger every day? Thank you.
I would like to move through here. Thank you. So if I can ask you to stand up, please, because you also had a question.
No, thank you very much. My name is Amir Sheikh, originally from Somalia, and representing an organization called the African Diaspora Forum, which is a consortium for migrant association. Mine is actually simple, not too much. The thing is, actually, before we even talk of international solidarity, I would actually like to take this opportunity to applaud the stand that the South African government have taken, something that 54 nations that actually are within the Muslims, actually Islamic organization countries could not actually do, neither the 22 countries that the Arab Union actually is. So it's a bold stand, and we applaud South Africa for this stand. But looking at it, actually, we need to also look in this context that charity begins at home. South Africa, what they have done internationally, we recognize, but we do not know the choice that have they taken, what the consequences at the end of the day will be. But at least charity begins at home. The human rights violation in South Africa, when it comes to documentation, the way my elderly have spoken, is actually too high.
What do you mean?
South Africa is a country that is actually new democracy, 30 years actually in existence, but it's actually one of the most actually, I can say it actually in terms of actually economy, the best in the continent, democracy, the best in the continent. It have ratified the international treaty for the OU, as well as actually the Geneva Convention of 1952, and it is one among the most progressive countries that have gone further, domesticating these international treaties to what comes out of the Refugee Convention or the Refugee Act of 1998. But how we get this documentation are totally actually different. You can be 20 or 30 years in this country and still remain and documented in South Africa.
Thank
to
you.
go and get access into documentation, you have to pay it for,
So
and
corruption.
this is actually worst. But lastly, looking at your panel, if truly actually you wanted at least it to be very productive, you will have actually to bring the two sides that are actually fighting in Israel, in the Middle Easterns, the Jewish vis-a-vis the supporters of the Palestine. But looking at your panel, it looks more of actually pro-Palestinian, and the only Jewish actually that are here are those who are actually in support. So what I will actually say is that let's actually look the next time, at least when we bring the likes of even the Jewish Board of the Deputies, the Zionist Federation, and others, so that the equation is balanced. And lastly,
no, that's
Okay,
your
thank you.
that's your last one. Thank you. Thank you. You had Amir. Thank you. But you had 3 last points. Shannon, first question. Can I get you to please address the comments about the situation in Eswatini and how I think you said you feel South Africa has not done enough. In fact, all you've had, you said, was a statement of concern.
Well, it's true. We can always do more, and I think that's a fair point. I think the problem South Africa's had ever since '94 is when we say things loudly, as when Madiba had criticized Nigeria for killing Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni activists, we were slammed by the rest of the continent. And basically we had to walk it down because they didn't want South Africa to throw its weight around and criticize other African leaders. And this is a country that is right there in the belly of South Africa. It's very difficult to sometimes use megaphone diplomacy, which is why we often adopt what Mbeki had believed in, which is quiet diplomacy. And there is those discussions behind the doors. Sometimes they're not that effective. And I do appreciate the human rights concerns on the ground in Eswatini. And I think we need to have maybe more introspection about what can be done.
Sam, does quiet diplomacy work? Quiet diplomacy, does it work?
I've never really thought about quiet diplomacy, I must say. I think there's limits to what we can expect our governments to do. Given the nature of our governments, given the nature of imperialism and the types of pressures that all of our governments on the continent are facing, given the inundation with debt, whether that's the US, World Bank, IFC, this debt is silencing our countries. It is forcing our countries into trade relations and international relations that actually go against the interests of the majority of our citizens. So I think at the end of the day, for me, what is really important is that I don't see our South African government going very far on the DRC. What I do think is very important is we need to see much more galvanization of people. Over the last 25 years, 5 to 6 million people in the DRC have died.
15, point of correction.
It's 15, okay.
million.
I know 5 to 6 million. But that is a vast number. It exceeds the total population of Denmark. How is it possible that our government has said nothing? How is it possible that we do not see every day on the news stories? How come social media is not plastered with the stories and the images of what is going on in the DRC? So we must come back to the question, A, whose lives really count in this world? And Africans, Black Africans, are right at the bottom of the agenda. Black Africans will continue to die and be exploited, so corporations and the elite, whether they're from Israel or they are from France or they are from China, will continue to benefit.
Gotcha.
We as people, Africans, we need to break the boundaries, the borders, and we need to act in solidarity. We need to be truly Pan-African in the way that we approach our relations with each other.
John, I want to take Amir's last point where he was saying, even in the conversation that we're having, for it to have been productive to get anywhere, we should have, in fact, have invited the likes of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Do you think that would have moved us further in the conversation, especially on the issue of South Africa's foreign policy, which we know they're very critical of, including going to the ICJ?
When South Africa was an explicitly formal apartheid country, and people were sitting down trying to do everything they could do here and in all the neighboring countries and across the world, did they need to invite the National Party government to the table to figure out how to overthrow a system of racial oppression built on colonial foundations. No. It's the same situation now. The reason we sit here, South African Jews for a free Palestine, is because Zionism is a complete abomination according to any Jewish principle or value, right? It turns Israel into an idol and turns the religion into idolatry, right? And it violates any sense of sanctity of life, of human dignity, of equality, right? The reason that the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in particular struggles with this and their entire political agenda is because they refuse to recognize that Zionism is a form of European imperial colonialism and it's white supremacist. And that's exactly what connects what happens in the Middle East to South Africa. We have to talk about where wealth is in this country. And it's in white hands and it's in corporate hands and it's tied up with extraction. And we sit here every single day with 10,000 children, according to Department of Health Research, who die with the underlying cause in this country being malnutrition, right? That's the picture.
TK, there was a question from the gentleman right behind you about, I want you to phrase it for me again.
How long should we wait until economic trade can be sanctioned?
How long do we wait?
It's not a question of how long you wait, it's an issue of how you do it, right? Let's play it out, because let's play it out logically and what happens, right? Remember, you have treaties that you've agreed to. And if you don't believe that really counts, you have to remember even the South African government, formally, South African government, the African National Congress, coming into 1994, was obligated to pay apartheid debt, right? So it's not, when I was saying you don't just close the tap, is you need to also be able to calculate. Because he was saying that, look, he comes from the Free State. As you know, the Free State economically has been in great decline. There's ghost towns, right? Now, if the South African government were to say, listen, we don't like we don't like the European Union, we don't like the United States of America, because of their stances, we're simply going to close the tap. How then do you think we're going to be able to trade with those countries? How do you explain to citizens in the Free State? And I know the concept of elites was used here, right, about foreign policy. Yes, foreign policy is usually the purview of elites. But it's very odd that when we have to speak to South African citizens to get their viewpoints, foreign policy goes very down low. What they want is food and economic development. So if you can answer to the average South African that is struggling that question, then look, go tell the South African government, whoever they may be post to whatever happens currently, to be able to go shut the thing down. You just don't do that.
Okay. TK, thank you. There was a hand over here. I'll come to you later. Can I ask you to please stand up because you had your hand up earlier?
Yes.
Your name and
I'm
what you want to say.
Giatlaretse Mantlati Mahuma. I'm from the Eduforce Midrand campus. And what I've noticed as a student is that, or mostly as the youth, we see this as a trend and then it dies out. So my question to the panel is, how can we as South African youth, how can we contribute to the long-term stability and development in Palestine beyond just like immediate humanitarian assistance? More like we can boycott as much as, but what else can be done? And also, Mr. TK, what you said to me, it's like you telling us to turn a blind eye as the youth. How, we come from a country where we talk about Ubuntu. How can we just stand there and hear about genocide from other countries when we know that other countries actually helped us to get through apartheid? Yes.
Thank you. Sir, your name and where you're from. Ali, can I ask you to please speak up for us?
Thank you so much. My name is Ali Dua from Malawi. A lot has been spoken on the podium, but mine is a concern based on the response from the authorities whenever issues has been addressed. If I may ask, what is the next move from this platform that we are having? In most cases, I do appreciate for the media, for their assignment, for their job that they are doing to address issues that are affecting the people and the rural masses or wherever. But to implement comes a problem. Now, my fear is when we are talking of migrants or migration issues, especially the youngsters who are leaving their countries to the other foreign nations or other foreign countries, like South Africa, they are not utilizing those resources that are coming from other countries. For example, some speakers were saying they're from Congo, they're from DRC. If you check them, some of their doctors, they are just being misused because they are here. why the government of South Africa utilize these resources from them, being maybe take their expertise and make it use in the process. If I may ask you, how many are we here, especially the graduates who have just graduated like last year in the universities, who are youngsters? They are not being used. Why do we see politicians, running into positions? Because they know for sure that it's a money-making position.
Right.
Within a short period of time, they are rich. But if you look at the graduate who has graduated at UJ, at West University, wherever, he's sitting at home, which is unfair. Now, we are crying for action now. Politicians have spoken, activists have spoken, but where is action now?
Okay.
Thank you,
Ali. Name and where you're from?
My name is Katisha Kodisang, and I'm from the Edgeverse Midrand campus. From what he said and from also what Mr. TK has said, it feels as if human rights and profits in this country have an inverse relationship. Because why do human rights need to be violated for businesses to have like some sort of profits or succeed in whatever they do?
Responses to those three questions, any takers? No takers, so I'll have to pick Sam?
So I think that's a really important question from our sister. And when you look at, I work on the extractive terrain. In order for corporations to make profit, they need to violate human rights. So they need, for example, if they're polluting water and they pay to clean up the water, they have to internalize that cost. If people are going to be taken off their land and people are properly compensated for their losses, the corporations must carry that cost. So these are just some of the examples. So that is why corporations violate human rights. So they can make more profit and they place the costs of their activities on the environment, on the climate, and on people, as well as workers.
Kilani, to Ali's point, we gather, we have programs, government itself has imbizos in South Africa. We talk about multiple issues, yet very little seems to change for the people who are suffering. How do we take our conversations and turn them into action that makes a difference?
You know, we have all the tools to address the points that he was mentioning. I mean, he mentioned the issue of, and another colleague mentioned the issue of documentation of people, but also the utilization of skills from both South Africans and non-South Africans. This is a very important point. We have all, you know, we can't look at migration purely as a problem. You know, there's a lot of opportunities that we need to be realizing that we're not utilizing through not documenting people. Once you document people, it improves your ability to plan as a state. You know who's coming into your borders, who is leaving your borders for the duration of time. Those people are actually willing to pay to receive some form of documentation. So when the state is not actually documenting and looking at migrants purely as a problem, you miss out on a number of opportunities. Our universities have graduates from all over the world. We have a database. We understand where in South Africa where there are skills shortages, and our universities also have registries which have actually the skill set. But also, how do you build linkages with people who are living in South Africa, from the DRC, from Mozambique, who are excelling in our universities? Some of those people are going to go back to those countries and do very influential things. How do we build the relationships with them now so that you can actually sustain those relations going forward? So I think at times we're looking at the issue of migration and the documentation of people as a problem, when it's actually a huge opportunity both for the state and its ability to plan.
Okay. Sarah Rashan, I want to come to you because I think your question was, beyond condemnation, beyond the calls for a boycott, what can people as far away as South Africa do for Palestinians who are currently displaced, being moved from one area to the next because it's simply, as soon as they settle, it becomes unsafe for them to live even in a tent?
Well, I think at the moment it's super urgent, but that's a really good question. I think, though, it is super urgent, and I think it is people putting pressure on their governments that gets them to shift. And I think that our government wouldn't have gone to the ICJ if they thought nobody in the country, especially nobody who has a vote, is going to support that. So we have to keep the pressure on, and we have to push them to do more. We do need to impose economic sanctions. Diamonds is our second biggest export. Do you know what? We export diamonds to Israel and we import diamonds. Why? Because we don't beneficiate them here. And beneficiation here, which we have legislation that says we should be doing and investing in, would mean job creation. It would mean a whole upskilling of people. So we're not just sending out raw minerals cheaply. We're actually polishing them. We're producing jewelries and the industrial things you do with diamonds ourselves. So there are all kinds of ways in which challenging a colonial, apartheid, genocidal state will impact immediately on that state, but will also have beneficial consequences for us. And we need to think out of the box about this. Again, I think it's people-to-people solidarity that will push the governments in places like Eswatini. If we look at what's happened in Kenya, the young people protesting, they suffered from probably Israeli-bought tear gas. And many people were killed, but Ruto had to back down. Ruto didn't want to back down because he wouldn't have let it go that far if he thought he could get away with it, and that was over an issue of tax. And I think we have to find ways of ourselves working together, and that does start at home, precisely through combating Afrophobia and xenophobia, through saying and recognizing, as was said, migration is not a problem. People move for all sorts of reasons, and it's always beneficial, because if it's beneficial for people, it's beneficial for all of us.
Right.
So I think it does start at home, and we have to challenge that, especially if you look at some of the political parties that now have seats in parliament. We have to be on our toes challenging that and speaking up for solidarity.
For a large part, my panelists have answered the question. I completely agree with everything Rashawn and Sam have said. I just want to go back to the first member we had who spoke as a student, and I mean just on that point, speaking as a student, I completely agree of this this trend kind of thing of viewing activism as a trend, or even a particular apathy that is particular to South African students that we've seen even at the encampment at WITS, right? We see these big encampments in the US, but we barely see any numbers coming out here. We see people posting on their social medias, but when you actually have the opportunity to make an impact in front of you, you don't show up. And it's like Rashawn said, it's people-to-people solidarity that will actually make an impact at the end, because as much as we can sit here and call on our government to make a change, it's like that's the word national interest we've been speaking about, right? At the end of the day, it's their economic interest that is at their heart. We need to be the ones who need to place this moral responsibility on him. We need to be the ones who need to call for these things. And as students, I think the only way to stop viewing activism as a trend is to cultivate these conversations within our communities and bring them back to ourselves. I mean, as students in South Africa, at the end of my education, I'm going to be graduating with thousands of dollars, rands in debt, right? How expensive is education right here? That's what we need to. We need to personalize it back to us and remind ourselves that actually we're still, and I mean, if I sound like a broken clock, we're still fighting those same demons and villains of capitalism, even here, even as students in our universities. We're fighting the same demons. And as much as we start to realize that, when we start to realize that we need to fight those demons for ourselves, those trends will stop dying out.
Okay. Hang on for us. I know you wanted a question, but ma, udinga uphuma? Okay, ma'am. She just needs to go out and to leave the room and just get some fresh air. All right, so we'll check on how she's doing later, but ma'am, you had a question that you wanted to ask.
So I want to ask a question to Mr. TK, right? So you mentioned that you want us to first clean our own backyard before we can help other countries, correct?
Yes.
So did other countries say to South Africa during apartheid that they want to first clean their own backgrounds before they can assist us?
Your hand was up first, so I'll take 1, 2, 3. Oh, now I've seen you. you want to go first?
Yes, I can. Hello, my name is Sihle Gilichana. I'm a research consultant with the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice. And I want to bring the conversation closer to home. Ngoba if sizothetha nge-human rights, masiqala apha ekhaya, ne? A common thread is that South Africa is not doing enough regionally. South Africa is not doing enough internationally. And I'm not surprised because there are people in this country that have died waiting to receive reparations and redress from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we have not been able to implement. So, Gengoku, my question is it that our pursuit for human rights through foreign policy is more important than our pursuit for human rights here, domestically in this country? Thank you.
Sir? Your name and your question.
Thank you very much, sir. My name is Sipesihle Shabalala.
Speak up first, please.
No, as I'm studying here, I'm studying as a broken teenager. I'm trying to ask myself, Uti, for how long will South Africa be a developing country? For how long will South Africa increase its own level of education? As a youth, for how long sizobuswa amakhehla namakhehlakazi? Kuyoba yini singakwazi ukuyimela thina njenge-youth bafika? This is our time.
Ma'am?
Good evening. My name is Virginia Makwaza, Preferred Njinji. There are many questions. First of all,
just one, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I want to infuse all of them.
No, just because of time,
okay.
Unfortunately.
So, first of all, we need to understand that there is a deliberate effort to divide and rule us as Africans in the world, in the continent. And the issues around the closing of the tap and making an example about the debt issue, we know why the South African government chose to pay the debt. They had a choice not to pay the debt. And they also refused when we were, as the civil society organization, forcing the corporations to pay reparations. And we saw that through COVID, for those who are young, but they were here, how they got more loans and misused those loans and not using them for what it needs to be. So when we talk about solidarity, when we talk about doing more, it has to be put in a situation where we understand that the reason why there's not doing more is because of the neoliberal agenda that is being pushed in the whole world.
Thank you. Ma'am, briefly, your name?
My name is Noxie Chabalala, coming from an organization called PIFSEC, Parents, Friends and Families of the South African Queer. I'm saying we are in solidarity with any other person who violates a human right. We cannot separate the struggle. It can happen internationally, locally, regional. If you are violating the human rights, it's pants with the violators, and we cannot be. We refuse to be the catalyst to supply the energy to where we know what that energy will be doing. When are we going to close the taps when we see the kids are dying? We are waiting for that rand and the dollar scale to go up and down to see that now, let's close the tap. Our people are dying. Whether it happens in Congo, it happens in Zola, it happens in Johannesburg, free Palestinians, people must mobilize. No, we need to be visible. When you want people to be in solidarity with you, be visible first. You be visible, you march, you organize. And then you go out, we will follow. We are saying we are in solidarity with everyone who is struggling. No violation, human right violation is the same to everybody. Whether we are in Africa or we are internationally, pantsing with the violators.
One more. Ma'am, unfortunately, you're my last one.
No, it's the best one. Good evening, everyone. My name is Her Royal Highness Princess Palesa. I am chief here in South Africa. Okay, South Africa's got too many problems, and we are supporting what they've taken the step. Although, if you know of the failures ICJ did, Bosnia, they never arrested anyone out of those attacks. Many millions of people died there, but it was represented in ICJ, and there were issues of arrest that were never done. Omar, he was given an arrest to South Africa.
That's the International Criminal Court,
that's
yes?
the International Criminal Court, oh sorry. And nothing happened, it failed. So my really concern is that whenever an African dies, it's not a problem. Only a certain race that when they die, it's everywhere in the world. Us as Africans, we were taught that when I look at my brother in Swaziland, which also from there, through my grandfather, he's a foreigner. But when a Chinese come to South Africa, he's not a foreigner. When other nations come to Africa, they are not foreigners. But I'm supposed to look at Congo and even call them Kwerekweres. To that extent, so much hatred that we've been taught, especially in the 30 years of democracy. There is nothing that they've taught us except that we must really hate each other. We must hate each other to the core. They have not brought us our land here in South Africa. We are still fighting for our land. The main reason with Gaza and Palestine is the land issue. But till today, nobody wants to go. Why is that fight? That fight is because of the land. They welcomed the Jews in Palestine. They stayed there, and they were so free, but they end up chasing their own people in their own country. It's the same thing that is going to happen here in South Africa if we don't stand up and unite as Africans. And really, I will support our brother. Fix your backyard. South Africa's got too many problems. Thank you.
We're out of time for questions, but panel, I want to wrap now and give you each a minute or less, if you can. You don't have to respond to everything, but pick an issue and respond. Shannon.
I'd like to pick up on what you said about the ICC, because I think what is really an amazing turn of events is that South Africa went to the ICC and they called for an arrest warrant of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. And now the chief prosecutor, it took a long time, but he finally has requested that arrest warrant. And it's one of the first times that we see that they're actually going to try to arrest someone who is not African. And that has been our criticism all along, is that it's not a court that's only for African human rights abusers. And I'd also like to mention at the ICJ that one of the significant things about us taking this case was it was the very first time that a country of the global south took a country of the north and charged them with basically what was genocide and egregious human rights abuses, and brought an issue of peace and security to the court and actually had a good finding on a number of different rulings. This is a victory for the global south, and I think we do have to thank the South African government.
I think the lady over there had said to you, if you call for a march, they'll support you.
I will not respond directly to this, but what I can say is that if you want to be a regional power, you have more responsibilities. A young brother doesn't have the same responsibilities as a big brother. So we need to understand this, and maybe we can move forward with this idea.
John?
There's two different pictures in this room today, but there's a lot of wisdom. The one is about solidarity and democracy, which doesn't mean we vote every now and then. It means people run their own lives, right? The other is what we at SAJFP have called racial capitalism, right? And you can think of it as elites controlling the power of life versus people in power in their own lives, right? The people in the room are right when they talk about elites versus the people, about divide and rule, about being visible and coming together completely, right? Anything else, this notion of what's good for South Africa, might be good for a few politicians and a few bosses. None of that makes it to the children who don't have food. None of that makes it to the people who die without documents, right? And the irony is that if you look at so-called Palestinians and so-called Israelis from a distance, they probably look the same to everyone here. People would say, I don't even see white and black, right? It's because they live in a system which has said, you count, and you don't. And that's how the world's been run, and that's what we have to change.
Sam?
I think many of us have been watching what's been unfolding in Kenya in the last few days, and I found it so inspiring. Young people in their thousands have mobilized, facing enormous risk. But they have achieved what? They have rolled back the introduction or the signing off of legislation that would have seen a deterioration in their lives. So I remain confident and hopeful in people. And I think it echoes what my sister was saying. We have to mobilize first. We cannot expect our governments to save us. We cannot expect our governments to lead us. We must take power back. Power to the people.
Yeah, I think what's important is that our constitution doesn't give us the luxury to choose between either being isolationist or, taking care of our responsibilities on the world. We have a Bill of Rights, which of course compels the state to provide certain services to the people, basic services, water, electricity, and so forth. And that should also be applicable in our international relations. You can already see from today's discussion, norms are changing. People are not happy to just accept profits for the sake of profits. There is a role for the state to regulate how the private sector should engage. Because ultimately, when the private sector runs into trouble outside of our borders, they run to the state to assist. So it is important that the state plays a more proactive role in how our private sector engages in a manner that is in line with our human rights commitments.
Thank you.
I think we're all each other's backyards, if you look at it. The whole world is everybody's backyard. And as has been said by a number of people, changing our conditions is not at odds with standing in solidarity with others, because that way we challenge our own governments. If we stand in solidarity with the people in Eswatini fighting against the repression that goes on there, if we stand with the people in Kenya who are fighting against repression and the government's repression is hectic there, if we stand together with the people of Palestine facing a genocide, we are collectively making a difference to our own lives as well. And I think we can see on all those economic fronts how we can use that to our advantage, even in boycotting and putting pressure. But we can easily do some things. We should ask our government, why don't they call for an arms embargo? They claim we don't sell any military equipment to Israel. If not, then it's a really easy peasy thing to do, because you can say, yes, we're going to impose an arms embargo. Why don't we make a noise about Israel playing in the Olympics that's coming up in a few weeks? People look to South Africa. Every Palestine demonstration around the world, you see the South African flag held high with the Palestinian flag. Our international standing shouldn't be compromised, and we should put pressure on the government, whoever comes in now to the new government. Kick Israel out of the Olympics, kick them out of FIFA, call that we will impose an arms embargo as well as a trade embargo. And that way, around the world, people like us who are protesting in countries all around the world and look to South Africa will take heart, and the Palestinian people especially look to South Africa. And that way, people-to-people solidarity, acting together to push governments, to push corporations, to refuse to be trampled on and have our rights violated, I think is the way we're going to see increasingly the world going, because we're seeing that now. And Palestine is, in a way, a litmus test of that.
Sarah.
I think it's like Sam said, power is within the people and power is within ideologies. When we talk about fighting off Israel, we don't just talk about fighting off just Israel or fighting off just Benjamin Netanyahu or fighting off just Biden. We talk about fighting the very ideologies that states like Israel are built upon. We talk about fighting imperialism, about fighting capitalism, about fighting European and white supremacy. And these are the root issues that we see in most conflicts and oppressions around the world. So when we mobilize together to fight the ideologies, to fight the root causes of these problems, is when we will see change. When we start realizing that we have to show up to fight these ideologies, that the people have to mobilize to destroy a system that is created to oppress us, that is created to exploit us, that's when we will see change.
Thank you. TK?
I think there's an old adage which goes, good foreign policy means you have to have good domestic policy. And the only litmus test that actually seems to count outside this room is what the elections tell us. And what South Africans tell me, looking at the new parties that have come in, is the issue of the national interest has come to the fore. And the government has not been great at that national interest. And South Africans are saying it does need to start home. And it needs to start with looking at our backyard. And secondly, I think there is a need to revisit what we mean by the support that South Africa got during apartheid. If I'm not mistaken, when you read a lot of those biographies, South Africans were put into camps, unlike what happened in South Africa. So this idea that, oh my word, South Africa must just so give. My understanding is, did you give because you were expecting an outcome, or did you give to assist us? And I think we need to start revisiting things like that.
We're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it. We've already gone into extra time. But my thanks to you all for being here. Thank you so much for all your insights and contributions. That'll do it for this week's edition of The Big Debate. We focus today on foreign policy, international relations, as well as South Africa's approach to human rights. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.